So our next session is diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is my pleasure to introduce Cassie Kline. So Cassie had completed her residency in general pediatrics at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. That's when we first met. And then she decided to go to the West Coast to sunnier weather and completed her fellowship at the University of California in San Francisco. After completing her fellowship, she is now back on the East Coast and is the inaugural Courtney Rose um, Foundation clinical researcher in neuro-oncology at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And so last year, with the events that have occurred over this past year, so, I think we all know we have been faced with the pandemic. We have been faced, again, very upfront with the inequities that exist internationally and within our nation. To quote one of my colleagues here at Lurie Children's, Cassie and I really began asking the question, how can we make this moment into a movement? I will go into much more detail of the fantastic work that she has done so far. And our goal has really been to address inequities within our clinical group, within our research group, and most importantly, inequities of access for our patient families. So with that, Cassie, I'm going to give you remote control, and you should be able to move your slides forward from here.
Okay. So, see, you guys are seeing just the slide deck, right, Angela?
Yes.
Fantastic, great. All right, well, thank you so much. That was such a lovely intro. So yes, as Angela said, we really started this effort in July of 2020. And so some of you may recall we gave a quick update at the fall CBTN meeting as well. And I'm really excited to give further input on what we have done since that last meeting. But just to bring everyone up to speed again, especially those that didn't attend the fall meeting, and as Angela alluded to, this effort really arose under a call to action among the leadership within CBTN and PNOC to advance our DEI efforts and really start to close the gaps in the care that we provide for patients and families from underrepresented groups. And certainly it was triggered by the current events that were happening around us, but certainly it's been a long time coming, and these gaps are not newly identified, and they have been in existence for quite some time. But from this more immediate or urgent call to action, we developed a mission to really work together to end inequalities in pediatric neuro-oncology specifically by improving access to care for our patients, broadening diversity within our community, and providing sustainable data-driven solutions. And to meet this mission, we had developed a three-pronged approach using data-driven findings, resources, and education, and in real time working to expand diversity within our research and clinical teams. So as part of this effort, we have now really come together to put in place some specific goals that we're working to achieve, and really centered on this guiding true north to improve outreach, recruitment, and enrollment of underrepresented minorities across all of our clinical trials and clinical research efforts. So to break down the spokes of this wheel, I'm going to use the next few slides to really expand on each in greater detail and to really outline the specific action items or the actions that we're hoping to take or that we have already started to take. So the first is really to review our clinical trial eligibility practices and ensure that our clinical trial and clinical research eligibility is as open as broad as possible to avoid excluding URM patients. And there's many ways in which our trials, unfortunately, either inadvertently or sometimes advertently, exclude patients. One key example is just the normal variants that occur across different racial and ethnic groups in terms of organ function and lab values and blood counts. And certainly if a protocol is set too stringently, then you have the risk of leaving out a certain racial or ethnic group. So one way that we hope to combat this is to inform on clinical trial eligibility criteria that meets the needs of a trial, but balances the maximum inclusivity of all patients as much as feasible. We're fortunate in our group and this wide web of collaboration that we touch the platforms of many clinical research efforts. And so we're really hopeful that we can start to set the stage for future clinical trial practices. Furthermore, we have identified that to achieve our goals in enrollment across clinical research, we're going to have to work to partner with industry. And in that setting, we hope to make trials both more economically feasible for our patients by potentially informing on reimbursement needs, and also, again, ensuring that there's the broadest recruitment efforts in place, and that we're not being restrictive in any way that would prohibit a patient or a family from participating in novel research. A third point that we have learned, among many things we've learned during COVID, is the great benefit of telemedicine and the variety of technologies to implement remote clinic visits. And these can ease travel restrictions or travel requirements for families, decrease time away from work, and generally lessen cost burden, which is a great benefit to many of our patients and families with limited resources or that come from non-academic catchment areas, which tend to be major cities. So we aim to continue these practices as much as feasible, even now that COVID is improving. And I think it's really giving us a new way to kind of advocate in terms of legislature or regulatory processes that we've done this, we saw it worked. How can we be novel in continuing these practices even beyond the setting of COVID? This will require us to be thoughtful in our trial design and outreach, but also to educate patients and families and providers that these options potentially do exist, and they are something that should either be asked of their providers or that their providers should be thinking of offering them before we automatically assume that travel requirements, clinic visits are not going to be feasible for our families. Another key limitation of trial design is the cost associated with the interpretation of study materials, such as consent forms or protocols, into multiple languages. These costs can be very additive to trial execution at the site level, and they currently do fall to the sites themselves, which ideally is actually the best level at which the language interpretation efforts should be made, because ideally the sites are the ones that are most well-versed in the languages of the patients that they serve and the languages that their community, that is most prevalent in their community. However, establishment of a central funding source for these options would really alleviate the burden at the site level and facilitate more uniform use of a variety of interpreted ICFs that are more readily understood by the patients and the families that we currently serve and that we are hoping to reach. So we're currently exploring the cost of centralizing some of these resources and looking for funding partners to help us so that we can say, we would really like you to open up this trial or participate in this research, and here's the amount of money that we could offer you to facilitate interpretation of all of the study materials to languages that you need. The next point is that there is already a rich amount of workforce publications in our field and throughout academic and research, showing that the paucity of underrepresented minorities across all levels of our field continues to be quite pervasive. This limited diversity certainly can impact how our patients are receiving the messaging about research opportunities and their general comfort in our clinics and research facilities. Furthermore, there's already been a large amount of work done illustrating the intrinsic benefit of a diverse workforce and a workforce free of bias. So based on this, we have developed some central education resources and education opportunities for our consortium members. Further, Angela and I are currently working with a consulting firm to potentially provide additional support as we develop further our more concrete overall DEI strategy for implementation across our consortia. So the last point I want to touch on is really what I think of, and I think many of us think of as the heart of CBTN, which is the data collection and data availability. So to this end, we really want to ensure that we're answering and asking the right questions as we embark on all the efforts that I just described. So we're currently working to ensure that we are positioned to prospectively collect DEI and socioeconomic related data in a comprehensive, informative, and consistent way across our consortia. A lot of the questions that have already popped up have been, how do we uniformly collect this information across all of the various platforms that currently have these efforts in place? So many of us are serving across a variety of working groups or consortia to really inform and make sure that we are uniformly collecting this information such that we're most comprehensively able to inform in future research and future trials. So in parallel with this effort, we are actually putting together a comprehensive publication on the existing ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic differences in our CBTN and PNOC patient populations, and certainly how these differences correlate with disease management and disease outcomes utilizing the existing CBTN data sets that are available. And then additionally, we completed a member survey in the fall to assess who makes up our consortia and what the general feelings and impressions are of CBTN, PNOC, and our home institutions when it comes to DEI efforts. So we're currently incorporating these findings into a manuscript as well, because we don't really feel that we can move the needle sufficiently in patient care and patient research and DEI gaps until we first look internally as well and identify ways in which we need to change within our infrastructures. So in the fall, some of you may recall, we reviewed briefly some of the differences in terms of clinical outcome data across the races and ethnicities and groups within the CBTN cohort that we started to look at. But what I'll do in the next couple of slides, and just to kind of close out, is I'll give a little bit of a glimpse into some of the data that we've also started to collect to date based on the PNOC and CBTN member surveys. So in terms of the DEI survey, we were really fortunate to, like I said, collaborate with the infrastructure that's in place with CBTN and then also PNOC operationally to distribute a red cap or an electronic-based survey to all of the members. From this, you can see we did have a member response rate of about 25%, which does not seem very high, but is actually quite in line with other electronics survey efforts when you look at other publications. You can see here that we had a good mix of CBTN and PNOC membership that responded, with a predominance of members that were both CBTN and PNOC members. It certainly was concentrated within our domestic institutions, and certainly we want to do a better job incorporating international input as well, because we certainly understand that these inequities do not stop only within our country. We did fortunately get a lot of variety of responders across a number of different roles, and many had been members of our consortia for at least 2 years. And so the next step will be to kind of break down, of course, the feelings and the climate input across each of these roles as well, because that will also be an important part as we're informing the type of environment that we have and the type of environment that we're hoping to create for all of our team members. You can see that not unexpectedly, our responders did have clear distinctions in terms of being a predominantly white, non-Hispanic group. We were fortunate to have a very strong female population in our responder cohort though, but certainly you can see that there is really a need at multiple levels to increase the diversity among our ranks, and certainly many of us are starting to participate in a number of pipeline programs as well, and collaboration across our groups to provide good educational resources and opportunities for people early on in training and education. And then the last 2 slides I'll just touch on briefly. We certainly didn't want to stop at just getting demographic data, and we really wanted to ascertain what the climate of our consortia are right now, and certainly help us define where we need to be heading. We're fortunate that generally the perception in terms of the environment of CBTN and PNOC is supportive of DEI efforts, and we have a number of different qualitative questions that we're still looking at, and I put some of the pending analyses in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, but we will certainly be pulling all of this together to really highlight where our gaps are and where we should go and how we can better be meeting our patients where they are. So the next major step as we continue this immense but incredibly necessarily and timely work is really to finalize the manuscript that we've all been working hard on to collect the data for over the last year, and certainly building on the data collection that CBTN has had in place for many years now. And we look forward really to continuing the partnerships with our foundations and ideally industry to continue to help centralize some of these efforts and resources and really complete all the actions that we have so fervently put in place over the last year. And so want to thank every single one of you that's contributed to this effort. And if there are any ways that anyone would like to further be involved, certainly don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cassie. That was wonderful. If anyone has any questions, we have a minute or two. Cassie did a great job getting us closer back to schedule.
I tried to talk fast, but.
Just wanted maybe to put a plug in as people are thinking about questions, if they have any for Eric Durbin's talk coming later today, in part because, or maybe it's next even, in part because, you know, there's diversity and heterogeneity across multiple different layers. And I think some of the work Eric has done in Kentucky really highlights just another lens of disparity that intersects with everything that Cassie just described.
Just one shout out for Cassie, that this is an incredible amount of work in a short period of time. And so I think, as she mentioned, we started the initial conversations and the discussion of this less than a year ago. And so, yes, we do welcome foundations, advocates, as well as anyone from any of the CBTN or PNOC institutions to join us. And, you know, I've personally been impressed with Cassie's motivation for this, and I've learned a lot from her in the process.
Thanks, Angela. It is a team sport out there. We've been fortunate to have a great group of people.
And then just one other point that, you know, a lot of the work that Cassie has done has also informed how we're thinking about presenting and making data available. So it's easier to discover these kinds of questions and disparities. And I've already had, you know, groups externally reach out to the CBTN and use data from the CBTN to ask additional questions from that lens.
There's a question in the chat. Says, are there proposed solutions for enrolling / reaching patients outside of academic institution catchment areas?
Yeah, that's a great question, you know, and I think it's going to be a mixed effort, to be honest. I think there will ultimately have to be some sort of kind of funding, and certainly we have talked to foundations in terms of having potentially a more centralized resource when families and patients need to travel or miss work and things like that, because certainly everything is done right now at an institutional level. And again, similar to having a centralized funding mechanism for interpreting services, it would be amazing if we can have a travel resource for families. And then again, I think really we need to explore partnerships with our industry collaborators in terms of having, you know, exploring. We tend to focus on funding for the research itself, but I think really exploring kind of funding to support reimbursement, and certainly industry sponsored trials frequently have this. And I think we need to potentially be more thoughtful about this in investigator initiated trials. And then again, I think that incorporating a lot of the technologies that we have really become more facile within the last year. So telemedicine, and then certainly within PNOC, we're also starting to explore the virtual trial space to see how we can really catapult doing as many things remotely, utilizing the breadth of technology that is out there. And certainly we have come to understand we don't need the patients to come see us for labs. We don't need the patients to necessarily come see us for scans. So how can we really meet the patient where they are, where they live? And to Adam's point, that doesn't necessarily mean this crosses really every facet of our patient cohort. So across race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, wherever they may live. The benefit of the technologies is that almost everyone actually has an iPhone, and like, let's use the resources that they have. So it's going to be a multifaceted approach. And I'm just excited about the potential opportunities in the next couple months to years.
Maybe just another plug for an upcoming speaker. Warren Kibbe will talk about CCDI. And that's, an area where I think there's a ton of potential to address some of this, in part because diagnostics is a barrier to entry. So having access to sophisticated molecular clinical diagnostics, irrespective of socioeconomic or location status, is at least one part of the narrative and odyssey of finding the right clinical trials and understanding positioning for care.
Say one last comment before we segue into sessions two. Nancy Goodman had reminded us, and I'll be honest, I was not aware that the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, the FDA actually requires Congress to check that the sponsor's trial has representation for adequate race and ethnicity before the sponsor can win the pediatric exclusivity. So, I think this is just a reminder to every investigator as you're working with pharma that they have actually done their due diligence with this as well.
Yeah, and I think part of the work that we're putting together with this comprehensive reporting and data sets that we're hoping to publish will further help inform that perhaps the incidence and prevalence among certain groups that have frequently been neglected is actually much higher and needs to be recognized in these types of statistics.